So I am joining you bright and early from Colorado in the United States. So it's not even, I think it's 6:40, 6:45 a.m. here. So um, I'm going to talk a bit about hazard analyses for food fraud and thinking, I guess, more broad in terms of how you think about food fraud risk. So, for a little bit of context, I will try to speak slowly. I tend to speak quickly, and I know there is simultaneous translation. So, I will do my best to try to speak a little bit more slowly. I work with a company called Food Chain ID, and I am in the Food Safety Solutions group. And so that group includes things like certification to a lot of the GFSI standards or certification programs, risk assessments, and then some databases, including the food fraud database that we have. And we are also a distributor of another system called Horizon Scan. But the company works very broadly around the world in food safety on regulatory compliance tools for things like food additives and contaminants. We do some consumer label verification. So programs such as non-GMO, USDA organic, and now vegan and vegetarian. And we also do some testing, so DNA-based testing and some other testing services. But today we are here to talk about food fraud. So we're going to talk about a little bit about a hazard analysis and how you include food fraud in that analysis. I'm going to talk about the development of a food fraud program, data sources that can be used to inform fraud risk. And this is really where we spend a lot of our time. We are constantly looking at public sources of data to support risk assessments for fraud. I will show you a little bit about our food fraud database, just some high-level statistics from it. And then we'll look specifically at some commodity examples. I'm going to talk briefly about the cost of food fraud because there's an interesting project happening in the UK right now about that, and then just end with some thoughts about the future of food fraud prevention. So I'm sure you are all very familiar with this graphic that talks about what food fraud is from a GFSI perspective. So I won't go through this too much. I wanted to show it to lead into our definitions of food fraud. So they're very similar to the GFSI definitions. But I like to mention this because since we are tracking and standardizing information related to food fraud, we try to be very specific in our descriptions of how fraud happens. And then we use these categories in our database. So something like dilution and substitution is very specific to increasing the weight or the volume of a product. So it can be a solid product like a fish fillet, or it could be olive oil or juice. But the idea here is something is being added to increase the weight or the volume. Artificial enhancement, on the other hand, is the addition of a substance for a functional effect. So it could be a color additive or a non-protein nitrogen source, something like that. You don't necessarily have to add very much, but the effect is a functional effect. And then I think most of the other ones are self-explanatory. Again, similar to the GFSI definitions. I will mention, though, fraudulent labeling claims is also very specific in that it is related to production techniques. You could argue that all food fraud is essentially fraudulent labeling at in some aspect, but we use that term to really, to really capture those instances where there's a production technique that has been misrepresented. So something like organic, kosher, halal, those types of things. Now, we know that this idea of a hazard analysis is a key feature of many food safety frameworks. It's something that has to be done. This is some of the information that can be used to support a hazard analysis for raw materials. Obviously, government regulatory reports, the scientific literature, outbreak data, those types of things, media reports. We'll talk a little bit more about this idea of media reports. And, obviously, a hazard analysis needs to be conducted for biological, chemical, physical allergens, and including fraud. So I think the interesting question here is that a hazard analysis, a hazard by definition, is something that could be harmful to consumers. And then the question is fraud always a hazard? And I think that the assumption is that it isn't necessarily. Often it's not a hazard. But I think Bert made this point yesterday, which is a great one, which is that not knowing the true contents of a raw material just kind of automatically makes it a potential hazard, because you might not be handling it in the correct way or addressing the hazards that could be in it, the allergens and all of that. So I do think it's important that a hazard analysis should explicitly and specifically consider the risk of fraud. Eric also just made a great point, I think, which is that, the investigation. So we primarily work with food companies. Our work is with and on behalf of food companies to help them do a range of things, but in this specific case, to help them meet those food fraud prevention requirements. So again, I'm coming at this from a very different angle from a government or regulatory agency, but I think the point about the investigation being completely different for fraud is also a really great one, and an important one to keep in mind. So if you take this idea of a hazard analysis where you're looking at all of these streams of information for each raw material, that is then complicated, or the work is, exponentially increased by the fact that you then have to, if you're, for example, a large multinational food company, replicate that process in various regulatory environments and regulatory frameworks. So it is a very cumbersome process. It can be very cumbersome. I guess that is what I mean to say about that. It is a cumbersome process, and it can include a lot of data and a lot of data analysis. So when we're looking at the development of a food fraud program, this is the general idea, right? You need to look at data. So we're talking about, a food fraud vulnerability assessment or a hazard analysis, however you like to think about it. But the idea is to be looking at all those sources of data that I just mentioned, setting up some kind of a method for, I would say, reviewing that data and aligning it to your raw materials or the raw materials of the company that's doing this, or this could be, done on behalf of a regulatory agency. A lot of times people like to do a first pass, do an ingredient screen first that's a little less in depth to really pull out those raw materials that might be at the highest risk. And at that point, take those raw materials that might be high risk and do a full vulnerability assessment on those. And so that's going to bring in many other factors related to your supply chain. And I'll show you those in a minute. And at that point, you can develop a mitigation plan. So this is the general idea. This is the process that is laid out by GFSI. And so we'll talk more about what those data sources are specifically that we think inform risk specifically for food fraud. So when we're talking about a full vulnerability assessment for food fraud, these are some of the factors that should be considered. Food fraud is different from food safety. Again, as Eric mentioned, this idea of intentionality is really important. And we feel that analyzing the potential risk or vulnerability of food fraud requires going a step further than a food safety hazard analysis. So it is an intentional act that is designed not to be detected, and it may involve unexpected or harmful adulterants. So for all those reasons, we need to approach the problem slightly differently. We talked about pulling that data on the history of fraud or what is known about fraud, but it's really important to also consider these other factors. So what does your supply chain look like? What is your audit strategy? Are there audits being conducted that include specific measures related to looking for fraud? Do you have a good relationship with your supplier that is long established? It's these kinds of questions that really help shed additional light on the potential risk of fraud. What is going on in the economy? So these factors come from the USP Food Fraud Mitigation Guidance. You'll see the citation at the bottom of the screen, but they're very similar among all of there's quite a few kind of publicly available guidance documents for conducting a food fraud vulnerability assessment. And they're, at their core, they're very similar among all of those. This USP document calls this factor in the bottom right economic anomalies, but really what that is implying is the economic environment for a commodity, for example, and even thinking more broadly about what's been happening with the COVID pandemic, those kinds of societal situations that could impact the economy and the marketplace and the supply chain, all of that. So there can be a lot to consider for a food fraud vulnerability assessment. Now, when we're looking at data sources, these are the data sources that we tend to look at for our database and just generally for food fraud risk. The first one is media reports. So here's one example on the screen here that was related to honey fraud in Cameroon. So we do feel that media reports are a very important source of information about potential fraud risk. Obviously, they are a little bit challenging to deal with because we don't have any way to necessarily verify every report, but we do collect that information and we do standardize it. It is the second highest source of information in our database after the scientific literature. And I'll show you more about that in a minute. But the way we capture media reports is we assign our assessment of what we call the weight of evidence for a report that comes out of the media. So if a media report just cannot be verified and it didn't necessarily come from a source that we know has a high level of credibility, we will put that assessment in the database so that people that are looking at the data can choose to look at that information or not. But what we have found is a lot of times these issues that start out as unverifiable media reports can eventually kind of bubble up and become something that has effects that are either documented by a regulatory agency or that are more global. But we do recognize that some media reports are, let's say, problematic or not necessarily verifiable. So that's something that we account for in the system. Another source of information is government reports and alerts. Obviously, this is, extremely important for food companies to be monitoring these types of reports. Certainly, that is kind of the bare minimum of what food companies should be doing. So there's tremendous value in these, and they are extremely important. But as Eric mentioned, also, they're not always necessarily making that distinction of when something is fraud. So this is a recent report that came through the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, the RASIF system, the public side of the RASIF system, for various Sudan dyes that was in, it doesn't say it here, but I believe this was sweet pepper powder. And you can see here that it wasn't necessarily classified as fraud. And obviously, that is not the goal of a system like this. The goal of a system like this is to get out the alerts when there might be an issue happening so that other member states or other jurisdictions can take action. But from our perspective, we do find it important to really look at that information critically and pull out things that might be fraud, again, to support the food industry in helping to protect their supply chains. So this is one area where it's an example of, it can be really beneficial to go beyond, a step beyond just looking at regulatory alerts and reports and thinking about fraud a little bit more critically. Another example here, and I apologize that the graphic is a little bit blurry. This example is courtesy of Bert. He put this together for a chapter that we wrote on food fraud mitigation. This was from back in 2008 during the melamine crisis. And you can see that this is two reports of melamine in a food product, one of which had an analytical result of 153 parts per million of melamine. And this was classified as an industrial contaminant. It was not classified as fraud at the time. And this product had an analytical result of just 25.6 parts per million, and it was classified as fraud. So again, this is not in any way to speak ill of regulatory reports. They are extremely, valuable and validated and critical to monitor. The point here is just that standardization of fraud information isn't always happening. And so it's just a little bit of an extra step that's good to take when you're thinking about a fraud vulnerability assessment. We also track and capture information from the scientific literature. So this is the most prevalent source of information in our food fraud database. There's an example here. It's a tremendous source of information on potential risk, and I will show you some examples of that. But the idea here is that if there is a published scientific paper on a detection method, for example, for fraud, we are inferring that somebody knows that is an issue. Somebody has spent that research money on developing that method and publishing the paper, either because it's a known issue within the industry or maybe on the part of regulators or even just, in academics who are working with industry. So we are inferring information from these scientific publications. And so when we are standardizing food fraud risk information, these are the primary two record types. So incidents, which is an actual documented occurrence of fraud. There is some contextual information about when and where and all of that. And then what we call inference records. So this is the probable knowledge of fraud. It is often inferred from published research or subject matter expertise, some other source of information about fraud risk. We separate those two for a few reasons. We want to be clear about the type of information that we are providing, but also, we're based in the United States, and when we were building the database, had to try to align to both the GFSI requirements and the US FDA requirements, which focus heavily on what is documented to have occurred. So that's why we made that distinction in the database. This is just a high-level summary of the information that's in the database currently. This was current as of about 2 weeks ago. You can see we have more than 14,000 records, almost 5,000 primary source references. And again, you can see we've got almost 5,000 inference records, but only about 2,000, just under, incident records. Incidents are prevalent, but not as prevalent, I think, as you think. Again, to the point that Eric made about, what we see is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I really think that's true. We capture what we can, but we recognize that there is just a lot of things happening out there that we are not able to capture, both because it's not necessarily being detected and because we are not a regulatory agency. And so we are only able to represent what is reported somehow in, the public domain. We do have more than 5,000 what we call food ingredients, but what are really raw materials. Not all of those have records. We try very hard to represent the landscape of food ingredients broadly, regardless of whether there is an actual food fraud record, so that it's clear kind of what we are tracking and how. I should state also, Eric showed a figure on one of his slides that it was on the slide about kind of the top 10 for food fraud. This database is the current iteration of that paper that he cited. So USP originally developed this database, and there was a paper that was published on it in 2012. This is the continuation of that database. So, the methods and the data collection and all of that is very similar. It's just evolved over time, but it is still the same database. So I just wanted to mention that for clarity. This is the global distribution of the food fraud incidents that we have in the database. So again, those records where there is an actual occurrence of fraud, you can see that we try to be as global as we can in our coverage. This database operations are based in the United States, but our company has people based all over the world that speak many, many languages. So we have a lot of resources in that way. I cannot claim that this represents the true risk of fraud globally. Again, it depends very much on local food safety surveillance systems and reporting. And again, what gets out into the public sphere. But this is what the contents of our database looks like from an incident perspective. If we look at the most represented commodity groups in the system, and again, this is based on our lens of looking at this problem. So you will see different numbers represented in different places, but through the lens that we view things, seafood and dairy products are kind of they usually go back and forth for the most prevalent number of records, followed by meat and poultry. Herbs and spices are obviously generally high risk for fraud. One note about dairy products, I think that dairy is a very geographically dependent commodity in terms of its risk of fraud. And so there's certain parts of the world where that's very well represented in terms of fraud potential, and other parts of the world where it's not. So I get that question quite often, especially when I speak to US audiences, that question about dairy. And I do want to mention honey, because honey is shown here at 6% of records over the past 10 years. But this is really it's kind of a single product. So I think it's notable that the percentage is that high. Seafood, there are so many seafood species and so many products. Dairy gets turned into so many products, but honey is kind of a very singular thing. So I do think it's notable that the percentage for honey is so high. Okay. And then I will try to move a little bit faster because I know we're running up on time. When we look at the way that fraud happens, this is what we see, again, in the database that we maintain. Dilution or substitution in various ways, animal origin fraud, botanical origin fraud, and you can see the rest of the information here. But I do like to note that the use of a substance that is not approved for use in foods is at 14%. So again, that is notable, and it is the truth is this is one of the reasons that we do the work that we do, is to highlight the fact that food fraud does really present a risk and a potential hazard to consumers. We do classify adulterants as to whether they may be potentially hazardous or not. I won't talk too much about this right now, but I do want to note that we do have this classification system, and we do tend to look at the number of records that are associated with a potentially hazardous adulterant. And so that's just another way that we are standardizing and tracking this data. So I wanted to talk through just a few examples just to illustrate again why it is beneficial to think more broadly in terms of a food fraud hazard analysis, and why it's important to go that extra step and consider as many sources of data as possible. We are all familiar, I'm guessing, with the Melamine incident. Bert talked about this a bit yesterday, and I think Samuel did as well. I will not read this quote, but this article it was actually a contributed paper at a conference a number of years ago, really is very fascinating. It got into a lot of the details of what was happening in China with the Melamine incident. So if you ever have a chance to look this up, it's very interesting. I thought this quote was particularly interesting. It became a systemic issue that seemed to be pervasive throughout the supply chain. But it did seem like a surprise at the time, and like it sort of came out of nowhere. It was a new type of adulteration. But when we went back and looked at the published literature, it was not necessarily new. There are 3 articles that we have captured from the late 70s and early 1980s related to the use of melamine in high protein products. So in this case, animal feed and fish feed, and there's another one that's not shown here that was for potato protein. So this is why we feel it is so valuable to be looking at the scientific literature, is that you can really get a heads up, to use an American expression. You can really get a sense of the potential for fraud risk. And so some of these things that seem new might not necessarily be new. Spices we know are particularly prone to fraud for various reasons. They are high value. They can have long and complex supply chains. And often their quality is determined by their color, which incentivizes the addition of colorants. In some cases, they may be industrial grade, not food grade colors. A number of years ago, there was a recall for turmeric. In the EU, I believe it's curcuma. In the United States, and probably, I believe it was in other countries as well, for lead contamination. And the way this was reported by our FDA was that there was a recall for lead contamination. And I think the assumption often with lead is that it is a environmental contaminant. Maybe there's uptake from the soil. In this case, the New York State laboratory that did some of this testing did a test for chromium, for chromate, and it was positive, which indicated this was lead chromate that was likely added for color. So this was a fraudulent act. There was a big recall, but it wasn't necessarily reported by that. Or reported like that. It was just reported as lead contamination. So just to get back to Eric's point about how it is, I think it is extremely important to be very clear when these instances might be related to fraud or are likely related to fraud, because it can affect how everybody addresses the risk, both the regulators and the food industry in the future. That lab also did this testing. We used to work with him. He is now retired, but he used to send out what he called his best samples, which obviously it could also be looked at as the worst sample, but this was one that just had a wide range of industrial dyes. So I think it just illustrates that if you look for some of these issues, a lot of times you will find them. That JRC report, the one that Eric mentioned about control of herbs and spices, I mean, that was so interesting to me. And that is the kind of work that's really important, I think, for documenting what is happening across the market for a certain commodity like herbs and spices. Okay, I'm checking my clock. I will skip through these slides. This was just, again, about this. Lead in spices is one of the issues that I feel very personally, very strongly about, especially here. I mean, this is some great public health work that was done looking at lead poisoning cases and then tracing that back to issues with spices in the houses or for sale. So I just think that there's a lot of ways to look at this question of food fraud risk. And again, this was a paper from back in 1985, already looking at the question of lead being used to dye turmeric and turmeric root. Oregano, I know, was also mentioned. This paper that came out in 2016, which again was very impactful on the industry and very impactful on all of us understanding what is happening with food fraud and food fraud risk. You'll see it was just these very high levels of adulteration, up to 70% in some cases, adulteration of oregano with things like olive leaves and myrtle leaves. But again, if you go back to 2011, that exact type of adulteration was documented in the scientific literature. So this is why we look very closely at what is published and try to extract the potential types of adulterants for different raw materials. Honey came up yesterday. So I actually just added this slide yesterday afternoon because somebody asked about honey, and the question was about how honey is particularly challenging to ensure the authenticity of it. So I wanted to mention that USP published last year an identity standard for honey. It is in their Food Chemicals Codex. This is the website for that publication. And it outlines specifications and methods that can help ensure authenticity for honey. The idea is for that standard to be used in business to business relationships. So it's a standard that can be aligned to throughout the supply chain. It is intended to account for the natural variability of honey, which is one of the analytical challenges, of course, with honey. And right now, a specific document related to honey fraud mitigation. So USP published a general food fraud mitigation guidance document a number of years ago, but right now, a document specific to honey fraud mitigation is in development. So I just wanted to mention that since the question came up yesterday about honey. I also wanted to mention soy lecithin. You might have seen there are issues right now with peanut protein in soy lecithin. And this is something we've been tracking, but we hadn't added it to the database yet because I know there can be issues of agricultural commingling and contamination as normal agricultural processes. But in talking to one of our clients who did a root cause analysis, it seems like that might not necessarily be the case. So we continue to track this, and this does seem to be one where I think there are at least questions of whether it is fraud related. I just quickly pulled a graph of soybean prices. You can see this, the source here, and they are high right now historically. So, okay. The last thing I will mention, I'm going to probably have to skip my last few slides, but this is a paper that we published a couple years ago. You'll see that Samuel Godefroy is on this paper as the last author. This was looking at, I believe the way we framed it in the paper was that we called it limitations of food fraud prevention programs, but it's maybe a better way to think about it as future opportunities in the area of food fraud prevention. So these areas that still seem to be a little bit of a struggle and where we could still use some more development and research. You can see them here. I will mention resource constraints at small and medium-sized companies, I do think continues to be a challenge. A lot of these larger multinational companies can have the resources to put in place their own bespoke programs for food fraud prevention. But it is a resource intensive challenge. And I still think it's something where we could have more resources to support small and medium-sized companies. That was one of the points made in this paper. Really evaluating the public health and economic impacts, I think, is another area that warrants further investigation. A lot of times the health impacts are either not acute or might be longer term and are more difficult to measure. So just another area that I think is important. Obviously, the continued development of methods and creating standards around those methods. Bert talked a lot about this yesterday, I think very informatively, as another area. And then the question of food packaging. Food packaging is something that is required to be assessed by the GFSI certification programs, but we do not see a lot of public reports of fraud related to food packaging. So that's not something that we track yet, but we would like to. And then just about the cost of food fraud. This is a project that we helped support. We had just a very small piece in helping support the second phase of this project. So I wanted to mention it. These are some of the previous estimates of the cost of food fraud or food crime, as it's referred to in the UK. There is an ongoing project. It is funded by the Food Safety, the FSA, the Food Safety Agency, and it's through the University of Portsmouth. I hope I represented the FSA correctly. But this is what they were looking at in terms of the societal costs of food crime, which I think is something that hasn't to date been very effectively assessed yet. So looking at all the costs, not just cost to industry, but victim costs, criminal justice system costs, intangible costs. So it's an interesting project. This is kind of how they are approaching it. They are working their way up from, instead of kind of aggregating things and trying to put together costs that way, they're trying to start from specific instances of fraud and working their way up to get kind of aggregated information on the costs of fraud. But it has been challenging, again, because of the dearth of data and the fact that oftentimes fraud is treated as a business-to-business discussion and not necessarily elevated to a regulatory level. So it's just kind of been interesting to be, we only have a very small part of this. This is Professor Lisa Jack at the University of Portsmouth, but to see these discussions about how to take this data and put together a model that represents the cost of fraud, it's been very interesting. I wanted to end with these 3 quotes from 3 different publications that I really like. I won't read them, but they're here. I know the slides will be provided later. These are all really great reading. So I wanted to put them in here. But, all right, I'll just read the last one. I do think it's important to say that unchecked food fraud does encourage further problems and inappropriate risk-taking. So again, to link back to this whole idea of a hazard analysis. Here is my contact information. I love, for people to reach out to me anytime, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here today.